the last time I was here, I was serving as the district engineer for TxDOT's Odessa district. And that includes 12 counties that really make up most of the Texas side of the Permian Basin. It has most of the activities in the Delaware Basin for the Texas side, almost all of the activities in the Midland Basin, and the biggest chunk of the Central Platform. So oil are us. We know what oil is, we know what the traffic is like, and I think it's important that we think about who we are and where we are and realize that we, in this room, are living in a different world than everyone else. It's true. It's not something that is just kind of our imagination. It's something that we learn through research, and that's my topic today. I'm going to talk about some of the ways we were able to innovate at TxDOT by using the research that the Texas A&M or Transportation Institute, that we call it TTI, that TTI was able to generate on behalf of TxDOT to help us get through all of the things that were happening in the Permian and still are happening at a much higher scale even today. So with that, let's go ahead and go to the next slide. First question is, who are we? Well, TTI is a research organization. We're part of Texas A&M system, and we do a lot of things having to do with transportation in a variety of areas. We try to deliver reports that are practical, that are innovative, and that they can be implemented. They are implementable. I shouldn't try words like that. Implementable on a regular and routine basis. So we try and get these ideas together and put them in a place where we can actually use them. Next slide. We started in 1950. Our primary focus at that time was to set engineering standards that were used nationally for roadways, for bridges, for the pavements and that sort of thing, to get us an idea of how these things should be built over the following 50, 60, 80 years. And we did a pretty good job with that. But next slide. We found that there was a lot of work to do in the process. We have about 400 employees around the state. In fact, some of them are around the nation. We even have an office in Washington, D.C. and Qatar. And that's not Oklahoma. That's in the Middle East. So we have a lot of employees that are primarily PhD research engineer types. And then we also have about 200 employees that we pull from the ranks of our student body that are working on master's degrees in civil engineering and things like that. We bring them on as well. We do about 700 projects a year. Those 700 projects come in a variety of flavors. So the next slide kind of gives you an idea of the things that we do look at. We look at things like freight, and many of you participate in the freight studies that we've been doing in the area. We work a lot on safety, economics, planning, operations, policy. We even have a security aspect, roadway security for events that are unforeseen, shall we say. So there's a lot of these different flavors and varieties that all work together to make up the body of research within transportation engineering. Let's go to the next one. The things we're doing today primarily, though, are centering around technology, and they also include in that technology umbrella the autonomous vehicles. You've heard of those. Those are the ones that will kind of drive themselves, the Teslas of the world, if you will. And then also connected vehicles. And that's one of the things we're going to come back to a little bit on, because that's something we actually use quite a bit here in the Permian. Connected vehicles are any cars or trucks that share some sort of operational data about how a vehicle is being used. So the other thing that I want to point out here is human behavior. That area of research is one that's overlooked a lot, but it is the single biggest factor in safety is how people behave in stressful situations, in operational situations, in situations that you see in everyday life. Remember, our everyday life here is not the same as it is around the state, around the nation. You are in a world all to ourselves. And so we did need to have some understanding of what that meant. So let's go to the next slide. There are three areas that when I was working for TxDOT as the district engineer, I came out here about 5.5 years ago and discovered that when it came to roadway safety and even some of the technical aspects of the roads, things were not the same here as they were everywhere else. In other words, I didn't know jack about a lot of the things I was supposed to know. Jack had moved and not left a forwarding address. It was just a whole different set of parameters that needed to be addressed. I didn't even know what questions to ask, but I didn't know who to call. And so I called TTI, and we entered into an agreement and a working relationship where we asked TTI to provide us with research. And I specifically said, I want something that I can put on the ground, because, you know, research that sits on a shelf isn't doing anybody any good. So we got some very practical results coming back from that. I came to value those results, and we were able to make some real progress in this area using those results. Let's go to the next slide. The first category that we want to talk about is there's three categories. You know, reducing congestion is the first. The second is going to be improving reliability, and the third is improving safety. The first category is one where we just really had to start out. I told you I didn't know Jack because he had moved, and this was a very good starting place because we really didn't understand why the Permian was different than every place else. All of our design standards as engineers are based upon a kind of across the board set of understandings. Those understandings did not apply here. So the best thing we had to do is take a step back and start over. Next slide. The first thing we did when we started over was to identify the things that we needed to do to improve the congestion in the area. Now, congestion in a rural setting is not the same as congestion anywhere else. Congestion in Houston is sitting in traffic back to back and not moving for hours. It's different out here. It's going 75 miles an hour at least, and then coming down to a zero and sitting there trying to figure out what's happening way up ahead. What we discovered is that we could either build out lots and lots of lanes to allow that congestion to move around what was happening up ahead, which is very expensive and no one was going to pay for it. Or we could look at why it was being bottled up. And it turns out that a lot of that was based upon the access points that were up ahead. How those access points behaved needed to be changed. So we had to go back and remember those standards that we talk about, engineering standards that we all kind of go back and adhere to. They didn't apply. So we asked TTI to go back in and reclassify the roadways based on what was happening on those roadways. You'll see that some of the zones there, you might not be able to tell where it is, but the one that's going east and west there is I-20. Up to the north of that's State Highway 302. Those are the sand zones. That's where all the hauling was. So that's a certain type of a roadway classification. It didn't show up in any literature anywhere else. Real research pulled it together, and we said, okay, now you got different classifications of roadways with different characteristics. What do you do? Next slide. We created an access management tool that says that when you're putting in a roadway or driveway on one of our roadways that's in the sand hauling zone, it has to look a certain way. It has to have a certain amount of space for left-hand turns. You have to have a left-hand turn bay, have to have acceleration, deceleration lanes depending on what's going into that driveway. Those types of things remove the congestion because it allows people to get out of the way of everyone else and more effectively and smoothly get in and out of where they're trying to go. Those kinds of things produce one data point in the whole overall big picture. It allows us to say, here's something that we know we need to fix, we fix it, and then do it again a few feet down the road or a few miles down the road, and pretty soon you have something that begins to make a change in the way that traffic behaves. And yes, we do have less congestion than we had back at our peak, and the peak was about 2018 in terms of our congestion. Most of this started going into place in 2017, 2018, and really started catching on in 2019. And it's been moving them forward ever since. Next slide, please. So that's one category. The second category, though, is one that's kind of strange, that you would think we would know a lot about pavements. And we do. With transportation engineering, that's kind of what we do. But in order to prove the reliability of the pavements, we have to know how those pavements are being used. And especially, we need to know how trucks are using them, because trucks are the ones that make most of the damage on the roadways. So you have to design for trucks. That's kind of the thought process. So the next slide. What we found out is we didn't really know what those trucks look like. We decided that we'd have to go in and go from scratch. The Permian is unique. Start over. We went back and identified what the traffic data needed to be for putting these things together, and we discovered that the trucks were way heavier than we ever thought. There are a whole lot more of them than we ever measured, and that there are a tremendous number of trucks that just don't match any description whatsoever that is found within traditional engineering practice. Next slide. So we had to redo that, and we also took a look at what the overweight vehicles were looking like when they were permitted. These don't worry about the numbers on here. I can't even read them. The main thing is that it was all heavier than we thought it was. And then the next slide, turns out not only that, they were heavier than they were permitted for. We actually had TTI take a portable weigh-in-motion pad, put it out there on the pavement in a whole lot of places where they'd never been placed before, and we discovered that some of these permitted trucks were overloaded by, up to 30-35%. Some of the unpermitted ones, we don't want to talk about those, but they were way beyond anything that we had imagined. And when you start putting all this together, we had to start over on how we were doing pavements. Now, TxDOT knows a lot about pavements, but what we have to keep up with, and what we discovered is that this region is different, and so we have to start tracking it on a routine basis. And so using this information, we were able to extrapolate out, and next slide, we come up with a document that was actually put into use in the Odessa district for pavement designs. The designs are thicker, they're heavier, different materials. They're more expensive initially, but they're a whole lot less expensive over time because they last longer and you don't have to go out and fix them all the darn time. So you have a cost-effective cost-benefit ratio that's associated with these that saves the taxpayer money, and it keeps those roadways reliable so you can get in and out, do your business, and do it without having to dodge around a pothole or an edge of pavement that's falling away. Next slide. Now, the last category of research that we looked at was improving safety. It turns out that the biggest thing we really didn't have when it came to safety was good data. And so we had to take a step back and decide how we were going to work on getting data that was current, that we could use to make on-the-fly changes to improve safety at specific locations. So what we did, next slide, is we kind of honed in on something that TTI has been working on and is probably the leader in the nation right now, and that's the use of connected vehicle. Okay, what's a connected vehicle? I can guarantee you if you have a car or a truck that is newer than about 2015, you are driving a connected vehicle. A connected vehicle right now is put out there in your hands, and the trucks are the same way. The manufacturers will install data telemetry that will give those manufacturers information to make their vehicles more efficient, safer, and will allow them to better prepare the next generation of vehicles as they go into the manufacturing process. That data is stripped from all of that data is then taken and stripped of all of its personal identification information and sold to a third party. Next slide. The connected vehicle, we call it CV data. the one we use is Wejo. That's the name of the company. Wejo buys this data. It has no personal identification on it, but it does tell you a lot about what vehicles are doing. It has vehicle movements. It tells you where that vehicle is every 3 seconds. It tells you the speed it's going, the direction it's going, the year, the make, the model, whether there's bubble gum under the seat, that sort of thing. It gives you a lot about driver events. And this is really important because it tells you whether your seatbelt is connected. It tells you whether or not you're having what we call a hard braking or a rapid acceleration going on. That information in turn tells us where problems are occurring on the road. If they keep having hard braking at one location, that's a problem. So it's a problem that we can potentially fix through an infrastructure fix. So next slide. So we started off with the easy stuff. We took some of this Wejo data, the connected vehicle data, and identified a speed profile for a particular location. This one was done as a part of an accident out just to the west of Kermit. This was when that project to build the bridge on 302 across 115 and the railroad started. Just west of there was a fatality, and a young girl was killed when a truck rear-ended him. So we built this profile, and what it told us is that the speeds approaching that particular area were far too high. So what can we do to fix that? So the next slide, what we ended up doing is putting together the data to try and identify where that too high speed is, and started backing out the slow down signs, even added additional rumble strips. Some of you probably drove across them, added additional lighting and signage for certain types of characteristics, and it removed the problem. We no longer had fatalities or injury accidents at that location. So it's something that we were able to take the data, instead of leaving it on the shelf, we were able to put it to work. The time from the time the accident occurred to the time that the implementation was done was less than a week. So we didn't have to go out and find out what was happening or identify it. We were able to scientifically, in an engineering fashion, identify what needed to be done. That is real progress using research. Next slide, please. There are another set of areas where we use this kind of connected data. We also use some traditional data on this. We looked at the way in which crashes were occurring and where they were occurring on the roadways in the Texas side. 4-lane undivided roadways had a pretty high level of fatal and also what am I trying to say? Fatal and injury accidents. And then you'll see down below the 4-lane divided roadways have a much lower. Well, both of those are fairly expensive to build, but the most expensive is a 4-lane divided. Then we looked at our 2-lane with 6-foot shoulders, which was kind of a typical standard for the roadways where we wanted to look at. And we discovered that it fell somewhere in between. That's kind of what we expected. The rates were all higher in the Permian than they were anywhere else, but that's also to be expected because we're different. We really are. So the next slide. Then we took the connected vehicle data and superimposed a lot of the data that we had on roadways throughout the state of Texas, where there were also fracking operations in place, and we discovered something very important. There are roads called Super 2s, where you have 2 lanes going in one direction, 2 lanes coming in the other direction, and you just alternate them off. 2 miles of 2 lanes in one direction, 1 lane's coming at you, then you flip it over. And that gives you a chance to pass and move around a little bit more conveniently. Turns out the accident rates are actually lower on those than they are on 4-lane divided when you're talking about small volumes of traffic. And small is relative. We're talking about 15,000 vehicles a day. That's more than on most of the roadways in this area. What that told us is we could reprogram all of our roads, all of the construction that we had listed, and we could set it up to where the amount of money that we would spend would allow us to go further and faster. We were able to put down Super 2s where we thought we were going to have to wait for money for 4-lane divideds. And we were going to be able to put Super 2s down in a fraction of the time and a fraction of the cost in the same right-of-way. So all of a sudden, you're seeing us put a lot of Super 2s in Texas, in the Permian, because they're actually safer than the 4-lane divided highways. You can't get as fast on the Super 2s as you can on a 4-lane divided, so that's part of the reason. But part of the reason is they're manageable. You can see what's happening. You can slow down, and you will not have as many obstructions and conflicts that are unmanageable and unexpected. It's a tremendous opportunity, and it saved us millions in the process, and it allows us to get those projects done faster. Next slide. So one of the other things that came out of CV data is better access design. You know, we talked about having a better looking access, but it also means controlling where that access design is. This is just south of Odessa on 385. You have the dirt crossovers that no one's supposed to be using, and you have the crossovers that are there that no one uses even though they're supposed to. So we use the data from CV to reevaluate that. So next slide, please. Each one of those little dots represents a data point or 2 or 5, or in this case 180, I believe it is, data points doing some sort of movement over a 6-month period in a particular location on 385. That location on 385 did not have a crossover. But yet, on the far end over here, where there is a crossover, it didn't have nearly any data at all. So all of a sudden, we knew we needed to just simply move that particular, close one crossing and open the other up. This project is under construction. That change is being made with a field change, and it doesn't cost us a whole lot, but it's something that can be done quickly, efficiently, using data that's readily available. So I guess that's those are just examples of what we've found when it comes to using this kind of data, and it's beginning to pay off because this data is fairly inexpensive to get. It's a whole lot cheaper than sending a field crew out. So what we like to do is at TTI is take these kinds of ideas and see how far we can push them, and then see where we can drop them in to where it'll make a difference to the taxpayers when it comes to your investment in your roadways. One last thing to comment on. Let's go to that next slide. We have a variety of things we're looking at, correlating some wavetronics to wave motion, pilot signing. You're going to see some different signing on the Texas side. But the reality is that over the past few years, we've seen results. Nationwide, traffic accidents have gone up. Crashes have gone up for fatalities. Since 2019, they have just continually gone up, and then last year, they skyrocketed. Fatal accidents and injury accidents. In the TxDOT Odessa district, since 2019, the fatal accidents have dropped 33%. The number of injury accidents have dropped 32%. When you put that into real lives, we're talking about 180 people who are alive today that would have been predicted to have not made it out of an accident because of some of these changes and the actions of the Permian Road Safety Coalition to make the awareness that's necessary available to the folks in this room and to the industry as a whole. That's 180 people that are alive today. 1,643 people who did not get injured on those roads during that time period because we're using research to better hone in and decide what needs to be done. Because we're getting together and sharing ideas that save lives. That's what it's all about. So if I die today, I will die today knowing that at least somebody out there is able to go back and see their families that wouldn't have been able to do that otherwise. And that makes me a very happy camper. So in the interest of not getting killed early and being run over because lunch, I'm standing between everyone and lunch, I think probably the best thing for me to do is go ahead and stop where I am, stop while I'm ahead, And do we have time for questions, or just? We do have time for a couple of questions. Okay. Do we have any questions, or is everybody hungry? You know how I ask that.
Sir, go ahead.
Is anybody looking at widening Kermit between Gel and Kermit? That's a very dangerous call right there.
You're talking about 18 between Jal and Kermit. I retired, so I'm going from memory, but I believe that the roadway from that's on the Texas side, State Highway 18 from the New Mexico County line south. That one is scheduled to go to contract within the next 6 months to a year. And yes, it's going to be widened with additional turning mechanisms and better shoulders, because the shoulders keep getting eaten by trucks that pull off. I don't know. I'm going to have to toss it over to Francisco. Do you know anything about 18? Yeah. If you want to write a letter, he says that there are no current plans, and I'm thinking that's money. So if you want to write a letter to your representative, ask them to send Francisco more money. He needs it. I was able to put a lot of these things in place because somewhere along the line, the legislature in Texas decided it was important to do that. But it is a political decision, and there are competing needs. So if you need to write that letter, this is a good time to do that. Did I say that? No, I'm sorry. That was a political statement, not paid for by anyone. Any other questions?
We've got time for one more if there is one.
With that, I appreciate your time, and we'll let this go before our summit clocks go off. So.